And so the U.S. and NATO allies from across the world have really poured in billions of dollars of aid. And yet we've seen Ukrainian officials this week really start to try and tamp down some of the expectations amid concerns that if they're expected to gain back a lot and only gain back minimal amounts and don't have the success that's expected, either the U.S. or countries in Europe could slowly reduce some of their military aid.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, there's been this standoff between Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama Republican, and the Department of Defense over its abortion policy. What does that look like?
Great question. It's important to start at the beginning. The Department of Defense came out with new policies over the last 12 months or so in response to the Supreme Court's reversal or overturning of Roe v. Wade. And so the big thing that the Pentagon now does that they didn't do before is they will now pay for service members or the spouses of service members to go out of state to receive an abortion if needed because they're stationed in the state where abortion isn't accessible. And so from Senator Tuberville's perspective, this policy violates what's called the Hyde Amendment, which says federal funds cannot be used towards abortion.
In most cases.
In most cases. And now we've seen not only the DOD, but the DOJ actually weigh in and say this is not in violation of the Hyde Amendment and that this policy actually is legal. Even though Senator Tuberville still disagrees. So to this point, it's been about 3 or so months since Senator Tuberville launched this hold on military promotions. And so as of right now, there are roughly about 200 that have been held up. And we heard from Secretary Austin earlier this week that said there could be more than 600 that the Senate would need to confirm by the end of the year, from now until the end of the year. So we're talking about a lot of people, and not only that, but a lot of families that are affected by these holds. And so neither Senator Tuberville nor the DOD really seem like they're backing down right now. However, we really don't know if either side will blink or how this will play out. But we've heard from defense leaders that this really will affect military readiness moving forward.
But Senator Tuberville wants them to rescind the abortion travel coverage policy.
Yes, and so we've also heard Republicans come out in both agreement of his stance, but there's been some disagreement about the way he's pushing this policy by holding up these nominations. We heard this week that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell doesn't support Senator Tuberville's hold on these promotions. That being said, the actual policy of the DOD providing money for people to go out of state for abortions, and we're talking paying for the transportation and all of the funding that's required or all the expenses, but not the abortion itself. And so we've seen a lot of Republicans come out against this, obviously, but not everyone is supportive of Senator Tuberville's tactics here.
So moving to Ukraine, the Ukrainian government has been talking about this counteroffensive for some time now, sort of telegraphing that there's going to be one. Some of this seems to be about seeing what kind of additional Western aid might be available to Ukraine. Talk about a little bit what the Ukrainian government is doing in terms of setting expectations for this.
Sure. So we've heard from the last couple of weeks, Ukrainian officials sort of almost downplay their expected success in this counteroffensive that is expected to be launched in the next couple of weeks. They have, even though they have, promoted this for months now, dating back to, the winter when the fighting really sort of grinded to somewhat of a halt, that this would be their opportunity to recapture as much occupied Russian territory as possible. And so the U.S. and NATO allies from across the world have really poured in billions of dollars of aid. And yet we've seen Ukrainian officials this week really start to try and tamp down some of the expectations amid concerns that if they're expected to gain back a lot and only gain back minimal amounts and don't have the success that's expected, either the U.S. or countries in Europe could slowly reduce some of their military aid. And so this is all about making sure that this aid for Ukraine is long-term, both in the eyes of the Ukrainians as well as the Biden administration, which has said, pretty vocally that they will support Ukraine for as long as it needs.
But it's possible that the Biden administration won't be forever. The president is running for re-election next year. The frontrunner for the Republican nomination to run against him is former President Donald Trump, and he has a somewhat different view on aiding Ukraine and how to resolve the conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
He does. So, former President Trump participated in a town hall earlier this week on CNN where he was asked very specifically, does he think President Putin is a war criminal? He wouldn't answer. He was asked if he would continue to support providing aid to Ukraine. And again, he didn't provide a substantive, definitive answer to the question that was asked. He said multiple times that the war wouldn't have happened if he was still in office, and that he'd be able to end the war within one day. Now, we know that it's pretty unlikely that this war could end in one day, even though all it would take would be President Putin withdrawing his troops from Ukraine. So we really didn't get many substantive, long-term answers about what a second Trump administration would look like as it relates to the war in Ukraine and whether or not a new administration would actually continue the aid.
So on the Russian side of this conflict, there have been new tensions emerging between the mercenaries who've become a pretty big part of the Russian war effort and the Russian government and defense ministry itself.
That's right. So we've seen some fissures start to appear between Yevgeny Prigozhin, who leads the Wagner Group, and the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, the Wagner Group, as you mentioned, they've really been leading the fight in Ukraine, specifically in the city of Bakhmut, where the front lines of the war have been for 6 months now. Prigozhin and the Wagner Group were given the opportunity to lead the forces in Bakhmut, given all of the losses that the Russian military had suffered. But more recently, we've seen, as you mentioned, some back and forth between Prigozhin and Russian military leaders. And specifically, we've seen Prigozhin accuse the Russian Ministry of Defense of not providing them with the resources or ammunition that they need to take Bakhmut. And as such, we heard last week, Prigozhin threatened to literally withdraw his troops from the city. And so ultimately, a couple days later, he shared on social media that there was an agreement that was worked out and they would be getting more resources. But once again, this is an escalating feud between the two sides, and we don't really know how this will play out in terms of any significant conflicts between the Russians.
I mean, because in theory, this could have manpower implications for the Russians, which is a problem they've already been struggling with.
Absolutely. We heard earlier this month from the White House, actually, that Russian forces have lost 100,000 troops in Bakhmut over the last 6 months or so. Within that 100,000, roughly 20,000 of them were killed and 80,000 were injured. And among those 20,000 were killed, roughly half were Wagner forces, according to U.S. officials. So should Wagner actually pull from the front lines, this could be devastating for Russia.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.